Hello, it's Mr. Avis here again. We looked before at fraction and decimal equivalents, and now we're going to look at fraction, decimal and percentage equivalents, and then we're going to go on to look at how to find percentages of some numbers. If you think about the word percent, it's made up of two parts, per and cent. Per means out of every, and cent means 100. So percent means out of every 100. And this is the sign that we use to show percent. 100% is the whole. So 100% of 17 is 17. 100% of 35 kilograms is 35 kilograms. 10% means 10 out of every 100. 10 out of every 100 is 1/10. And we write 1/10 as 0.1 when we're looking at it as a decimal. So 10% as a decimal is 0.1, and 10% as a fraction is 1/10. 1% is 1 out of every 100, and 1 out of every 100 is 1/100th. 1/100th is 0.01 as a decimal, 1% as a percentage, and 1 over 100, 1/100th as a fraction. 50% is the same as a half, so 50% as a percentage, 0.5 as a decimal, and half as a fraction. 25% is the same as a quarter, so 25%, 0.25 as a decimal, and a quarter as a fraction. And 75% is the same as 0.75 as a decimal, and of course 3/4 as a fraction. A common misconception is to think that 20% is the same as 1/20th. But if 20% is 20 out of 100, then there are 5 20s in 100. So it makes sense that 20% is the same as 1/5. But it is 0.2 as a decimal, 2/10. Here's a handy table to show you the percentage, decimal and fraction equivalencies. You might stop the presentation now and jot some of those down if you think they might help you. So let's think about finding percentages of some numbers. If 50% is the same as a half, then find 50% of 480. So if 50% is the same as a half, half of 480 is 240. So 50% of 480 is 240. See if you can find 25% of 480. Of course, if 25% is the same as a quarter, finding a quarter of 480 is fairly straightforward. All we need to do is divide it by 4, or just half and halve it again. So a quarter of 480 is 120. So 25% of 480 is 120. Now have a go at finding 75% of 480. Finding 75% is the same as finding 3/4. In order to find 3/4, we first of all find 1/4 and then we multiply by 3. So if 1/4 of 480 is 120, to find 3/4, we have to just multiply that by 3. So 3/4 of 480 is 360. So it means 75% of 480 is also 360, because 3/4 and 75% are the same thing. Try and find 10% of 480. Finding 10% of something is the same as finding 1/10. In order to find 1/10, we simply divide by 10. You can see here that I've divided 480 by 10 by simply moving the digits around the decimal point one place so that each digit is one place smaller. So 10% of 480 is 48. 480 divided by 10. See if you can find 1% of 480. Finding 1% of a number is the same as finding 1/100th. To find 1/100th, we simply divide by 100. And you can see I've divided 480 by 100 by simply moving the digits 2 places around the decimal point to make the whole number 2 places smaller. So 1% of 480 is 4.8, or 480 divided by 100. Here's another handy little table that you can stop the presentation and copy it down. It gives you an idea about how to deal with each of those percentages that you might want to find. You might want to stop this little video now and keep this screen up and try and find the percentages on the screen. The next screen will give you the answers. Here are the answers. How did you do? Let's find some more involved percentages. So if 20% is the same as 1/5, there are 5/5 in a whole. So to find 20% of a number, we divide by 5. See if you can work out what's 20% of 2,000. Here we go. 2,000 divided by 5 is 400. So 20% of 2,000 is 400, because to find 20%, we simply divide by 5. So to find all sorts of other percentages, we can mix what we already know about finding those simple percentages. So let's take the example of 15%. Let's think about finding 15% of 2,000. Well, first of all, we can find 10%, which is quite easy. 10% is dividing that 2,000 by 10, and that's 200. And 5% is half of 10%. So if 10% is 200, half of that is 100. So if we add together the 10% and the 5%, we get the 15%. We add together the 200 and the 100, and we get 300. So 15% of 2,000 is 300. So finding 99% looks like it might be awkward, but actually it's pretty easy, because if we know 100%, so for instance we know 100% of 400 is 400, all we have to do is work out 1% and subtract it. So 400 divided by 100 is 4, that's 1%, so we take that 4 away, we've got 99%. 99% of 400 is 396. And we can build up other percentages in the same way. So for instance, if we want to find 51% of 800, we'd first of all find 50%, which is half, 400, and then we find 1%, which is 8, because 800 divided by 100 is 8. So 50% add 1%, 51%, 400 add 8 is 408. So 51% is 408. There are some percentages that we can find that could take possibly a little bit more adding up. So for instance, if we wanted to find 35% of 600, we could find 10%, another 10%, another 10%, and then 5%. So 10% is 60, another 10% is another 60, another 10% is another 60, 5% is half of 10%, so half of 60 is 30. So 10, 10, 10 and 5, 35%, 60, 60, 60 and 30, 210. So 35% equals 210. There's possibly an even easier way of doing that. So to find 35%, we might find 25%, which is a quarter, and then 10%. So 25% and 10% is 35%. 25% is 150. 10% is 60. Add those together and we get the same amount, 210. What about 36% of 800? Well, again, we could find 25%, 10%, and then 1%. 25 and 10 and 1 is 36. 25% of 800 is 200, same as a quarter. 10% of 800 is 80, which is divided by 10. And 1% of 800 is 8 divided by 100. So add that 25, 10 and 1 up together, 36%, and 280 and 8 makes 288. To find some smaller percentages can be a little bit more involved. So for instance, to find 8% of 500, we could just find 1% and then multiply it by 8. We could find 5% and then 1% and then 1% and then 1%. Or we could do what I've done here, which is 10%, subtract 1% and then subtract 1%. So that gives us 8%. 10, take away 2 is 8%. So 10% of 500 is 50. 1% is 5. So 50 and take away 5 and another 5 equals 40. So we can just work out some unknown percentages from some of the things that we do know. So it's slightly easier. Now have a go at the ones on the sheet. Underneath this video there should be a sheet which is the question sheet and then an answer sheet where you can check how well you've done.